So we're going to jump right into a 10-minute briefing from Christina Werner, who you would have heard from in the overview plenary, on Christina? Yep. Thanks. No, it's okay. A 10-minute briefing with additional detail on partnerships, economic development, and digital. And if you need to continue a discussion in the hallway is perfect. I'm going to hand it over to you, and then after we're going to move to a group discussion. Over to you, Christina.
Thank you so much, Nicole. So this room will cover off three slightly interrelated topics: economic development, how to enable a responsible digital environment, and partnership considerations. So just to situate yourself in the sort of broader context, these will be the areas that we'll be looking at. First, we'll start to look at our economic development objectives, and going back to our sort of overall goals and mandate within Waterfront Toronto, we've always had a goal of helping to establish a robust economic sort of prosperous region in that neighborhood. We've looked to create an innovation cluster in the East Bayfront area. Heading back to the East Bayfront precinct plan, there was a goal to establish 8,000 new jobs in that neighborhood, 3/4 of which were deemed to be from the ICT cluster, or the Information and Communications Technology cluster. With Quayside, we had a unique opportunity to leverage this project to establish Toronto as potentially a dominant hub for urban innovation. And this would align with city and federal policy around creating clusters of high potential. In evaluating what we were looking for and how well the solutions achieved our priority objective of job creation and the potential to catalyze an urban innovation industry, we feel that the proposal contains well-developed strategies to catalyze urban innovation within Toronto, and more specifically, building technologies, tall timber, new mobility, sustainable technology. This is where there seems to be the most significant opportunity for wealth creation. And the urban innovation market, just by way of context, is projected to be an over $2 trillion industry by 2025. So there really is a big opportunity there for Canada to be a leader. Looking back at some of the feedback that we've heard to date, both in terms of support and things that we were told that we needed to consider more fulsomely, generally there's been strong support for the opportunities for local companies to participate in the project and the opportunity around job creation. There were some concerns raised with regards to who controlled digital governance, with a strong message that Waterfront Toronto and governments lead all privacy and digital governance matters. And there have also been concerns raised about whether or not Sidewalk Labs can be trusted as a partner in order to deliver this project. Looking more deeply into the economic development proposals that were put forward, there were 25 proposals in the MIDP that we evaluated, all 25 of which Waterfront Toronto supported through the evaluation process. There were 5 solutions that Waterfront Toronto would support and advocate for potential government funding. These were all largely in the timber industry cluster. And 1 solution that may need regulatory or policy change and reform, which is actually the same in both digital and economic development, and that's around koala, which I'll discuss shortly. An important note, though, is as we moved through the evaluation, we recognized that the evaluation assessed the economic development potential of the proposals contained in the MIDP, and that this is an area that we believe will need additional analysis as the project program becomes more defined. The evaluation committee also recommended a similar scope of work. This includes looking at both job creation and wealth creation, looking at the ecosystem more broadly once we know which solutions may move forward and getting a comprehensive scan, and also looking at the economic impact on the revised project program on the new geography that was resolved in October. Overall, too, there is a note that we need to have ongoing monitoring of the effectiveness of these economic development proposals to ensure that our objectives are being achieved. One example of an economic development proposal that we supported was the mass timber buildings, modular construction and factory, where Sidewalk Labs proposed that they would put in $80 million to invest in a tall timber factory based in Ontario and leverage Quayside essentially as the first customer opportunity to deploy that timber construction methodology on a neighborhood scale. With regards to digital, there were 15 proposals that looked at how to enable a responsible digital environment. These are not the digitally enabled solutions that you would have read in the proposal. Those have been covered off in the other breakout rooms like mobility, complete communities, and sustainability. But these looked more at the internal accountability measures and so on that Sidewalk Labs had proposed. The internal accountability measures really looked at how they would be able to produce documentation and be held accountable around the standards that they are using, the focus on beneficial purpose, ensuring that they followed a responsible data use guideline that they had put in place internally, and do a proper responsible data use assessment on their internal accountability. These do not replace things like privacy impact assessments and threat risk assessments, but are rather mechanisms that we think will allow them to actually be able to produce the materials required for those more comprehensive documents. From a digitally enabled solution perspective, a good example is the automated schedulers, which actually fall into the sustainability bucket. And this is something that we would say we would support and include at the cost of the private sector. This looks at how you can use technology to reduce the consumption and ultimately the cost and increase affordability on energy by changing when certain appliances may be turned on, adjusting your HVAC, and so on. So it's really a home scheduler that can help to manage the affordability around energy use. And then there's Koala, which is a standardized mounting proposal that would go onto light posts or utility posts that will allow for a quick removal and replacement on different types of fixtures, whether those be lights or sensors or different kind of festival placards and things like that. It essentially would enable the data and power to a very quick and interchangeable device that would then allow you to do this very seamlessly and not have to close the street and bring in a cherry picker and have that interruption of traffic for an extended period of time. Just to remind folks, though, this conclusion does not mean that we have approved moving ahead with the project or the partnership with Sidewalk Labs. It does mean that we see merit in including these solutions in the draft innovation plan for Quayside. But feedback from this round of public consultation will help to inform those discussions with Sidewalk Labs and may help us to further refine the position of what may or may not be in the innovation plan. In terms of partnership considerations, Waterfront Toronto assessed 4 key areas when evaluating the relationship with Sidewalk Labs. The first looked at the organizational capacity and capabilities, including the access to partner talent and expertise, new knowledge, tools, and methodologies. The partner experience, so how decision-making occurred, the ease and speed of which that was done, how issues were resolved, reliability and consistency in delivering on promises, financial performance, both in terms of the access to new funding and revenue opportunities, as well as the administrative cost and time burden to Waterfront Toronto of being in the relationship with Sidewalk Labs, and public impact, the public perception of the partner, as well as looking at the broad public benefits that could be achieved through the project. In addition to that type of measurement, we've also undertaken formal due diligence, both in terms of legal and commercial due diligence on Sidewalk Labs. That's occurred in 3 different rounds. One when we selected Sidewalk Labs as our innovation and funding partner, once again prior to the execution of the framework agreement, and then prior to the execution of the plan development agreement. And these look at the more sort of standard pieces like team composition, capacity, financial strength, corporate structure, and any outstanding litigation. If there is a decision to move forward into an implementation phase, Waterfront Toronto would undertake additional due diligence on the partner prior to executing any implementation agreements. Regardless of the assessment that we've undertaken, it's also important we recognize the need to have risk mitigations in place. So if we choose to move forward to a project implementation, maintaining and managing the legal and commercial risk would include things like defining and sharing liability with a clear definition of roles, responsibility, and accountability, managing performance, either a shortfall or a default, and that includes things like having audit rights, and in this case it wouldn't just be financial audit rights, but also technical audit rights, backstop and contractual requirements, things like having financial security, step-in provisions, and so on. In addition, we are still undergoing a preliminary human rights impact assessment that may surface additional risk mitigation measures that need to be put in place. Just to level set with regards to digital governance and privacy, these were issues that were resolved through the threshold issues materials in October of 2019, just to reinforce where we're at with that as you enter into your tables. So Sidewalk Labs has agreed to comply with all existing and future legislation, regulations, and policy frameworks, as well as our digital principles and emerging intelligent community guidelines. Personal data that's collected for the project will be stored in Canada. Digitally enabled solutions will not impede fundamental freedoms and, where feasible, will foster accessibility, public engagement, and participation in Quayside. Waterfront Toronto will serve as the lead for the project on interface with governments on all digital governance and privacy-related matters. There will be further public consultation on any digital solution with an emphasis on ensuring engagement with groups that are most affected by those solutions. Digital proposals may be required to go through a public meeting process and formal approval process with government. And while I won't go through all of our digital principles are to the right, I would encourage you to pick up a copy of them. They're at the registration table. But you'll see that there is a focus on equity of access, as well as strong privacy protections, including de-identification of personal data at source. We also made some strides with regards to intellectual property at the same time, including getting a commitment towards a global patent pledge that will allow Canadian innovators to have the right to use Sidewalk Labs' Canadian and foreign patents without fear of patent assertion. So Canadian companies can essentially develop on top of the intellectual property that has been used by Sidewalk Labs for the proposal. There's also been a commitment around revenue share for products and services that get piloted in the Waterfront Toronto testbed to be able to actually share back to the public sector to recognize the contribution the public sector has made over the course of the past 2.5 years. And further, getting a confirmation on the licensing right for the work product, or the site-specific, as we call it, site-specific IP, that has been developed over the course of the last 2.5 years. So regardless of whether we move forward or not with Sidewalk Labs, we'd still be able to actually move forward with that to come up with a plan for Quayside. It's important to note sort of the next three pieces are Waterfront Toronto's commitment to help ensure that Canadian companies have the freedom to operate so they can grow and prosper. The first is really digging into the patent pledge and looking at non-assert provisions that clear the way for Canadian companies to scale and compete globally. Also, procurement provisions that respect the sovereignty of Canadian companies to ensure fair and transparent procurement processes to give them that freedom to work with other customers and other companies. And then working with governments, stakeholders, and standard-setting bodies on data and IP-related issues. I think there was one more slide. Nope. Okay. Before I hand it back over to Nicole, I just wanted to introduce a couple more of our team members. We have George Sigaric here, who's the President and CEO of Waterfront Toronto, Michael Wolf from our Innovation and Sustainability and Prosperity team, as well as Vance Lockton. We'll be roaming around. If you have questions, feel free to ask us as you have your table.
Great, thanks very much. And what we did in the previous group that seemed to work is, first of all, if you're on your own and you want to join a bigger group, just move. Second of all, in terms of the questions, these questions really are the same ones that are in each of the rooms related to the innovation specifically. But what we've done at the tables so far, because we're also focusing on partnership and digital, what we suggest is that you take a look at the 5 questions that are in your attached to your agenda. Your facilitator will take you through. If there's 1 or 2 of those that you think really aligns with what you want to talk about, I would focus on that. If you would prefer to take the conversation in another direction, go ahead and do that. And that has been, seems to have been a very popular choice for many in this room. So I'll leave it with you for about 20 minutes, and then we will report back from each of the tables. Over to you. What we've been doing at this stage in the room is just to have each facilitator give some highlights, either where there were some common ground or where there were some differences, and or any other direction that the conversation went. They will each be doing very detailed notes, and we will be summarizing those for the room as a whole. So I'm going to turn it over to you. Start us off.
Thank you. Short and sweet. Informed consent. So if you live in Quayside, you might understand that you've already consented to all this data collection, but if you have people visiting, they might not be aware of that, unless you have them sign a waiver when they come and visit you. And IP. So our table saw the benefits of it very heavily in the proposal.
Okay, so you want to see, your table wanted to see informed consent, and they liked IP. Yes. Good. Jenna.
All right, the first half of the conversation really revolved around trust and a bit of an analysis of Waterfront Toronto's trust with the public. People felt that this process certainly conveyed a lot of trust and built a lot of trust with the public. There was comments about how Sidewalk Labs, with their initial proposal going beyond the 12 acres in the MIDP, was a bit of an overreach and may have breached trust, but through the process with Waterfront Toronto leading up to this point, they felt that that trust was being repaired. And certainly there was specific comments about Waterfront Toronto holding Sidewalk to a higher standard than they believe normal developers are held to, and that has done a lot to build trust with the community. The second theme that we really moved into was concerns about data sovereignty and the navigation of it, that there needed to be more clarity from Waterfront Toronto on the types of experts that they're engaging around data protection, data sovereignty, and then very clear communication to the public around what the implications of that are. For example, there were questions around opting out of data collection and whether or not there might be negative implications for an individual who chooses to opt out of data collection. That type of information is very important for the public to understand going into this project.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
So our conversation centered around community development. Our group really wanted to understand how this project is going to impact the residents of Toronto regarding job creation and the communities that are actually in Toronto. So we're looking at youth, we're looking at the contractors who are going to be helping to build these projects. So we wanted to look at focusing on job creation and wealth from this project and how it will be distributed. We also spoke about whether this project is truly feasible. There are several recommendations that have been proposed, but a lot of these are new innovations, so we're wondering if they are in fact going to be able to be developed and administered to the level that they're being spoken about right now.
Okay, thanks very much.
So I've got sort of two broad opinions and then two things we needed a little bit more clarity on. One was for Waterfront Toronto to be a little bit clearer about the actual value or projected value of some of these innovations. As is, they're just sort of listed and there doesn't seem to be either a priority or just sort of a ranking of how much something could cost. So you could have 100 things for $100 million or 20 things for $20 billion. And so like just clarity around what, just putting some numbers to those words.
And that would help people inform their opinion about the project.
Right.
Okay.
And then just in general, as far as mobility goes and the technology at all, it's actually pretty conventional for what it is. And the innovations could actually go much further. And so this again echoes what has come up earlier as well, just sort of the risk aversion that we have in both Canada and Toronto. And then two things that we think more clarity is required for. One is in terms of procurement of Canadian technologies, Canadian companies, just clarity around how that process would work, and just the sort of legality, the sort of like legal requirements of that.
You're interested in more information about that.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And then more information about just what Google is doing in the region otherwise, because again, we're hearing about Google headquarters still getting located here, but it's still not to do with those 12 acres. But then, you know, how does that affect the plans here, what they're doing in Kitchener-Waterloo, what they're doing here, and how those things affect what is happening with the 12 acres?
Okay, so 3 key points for my table. So they reference the quote, data will be stored in Canada. So what does that really mean? Waterfront Toronto to go back to original proposal and consider if we even need Sidewalk Labs for this development. And they would also like to see a stronger role of the government and to decide what they can and cannot do.
Okay. I can hear people coming, but just before they come, is there anybody that wants to add anything quickly before we move to the full room? You will have probably another 100 or so people walking in. Of course, they had to scratch the surface, but okay, I think we'll leave it at that. And if you have anything you want to add in, we'll have some open mics in the full plenary. So come on in, join us. We're just about to wrap up. Thank you very much, facilitators.